Hi, I'm Stephen Hawley Martin, and this is part 3 of a series of videos based on my book, Life After Death, Powerful Evidence You Will Never Die. As I mentioned in part 1, I'm a man on a mission, and that mission is to help establish a new view of the world that encompasses the reality that consciousness is primal, and that your consciousness and my consciousness come from it. And as a result, they will exist forever. In other words, the bodies we inhabit today are like spacesuits. When they wear out, we will leave them behind while our consciousness continues on. Now, why isn't this the accepted worldview today? Why isn't it taught in school? Well, for about 3 centuries now, perhaps the majority of scientists and deep thinkers have bought into a theory of reality that was first stated by the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes. He argued that aside from God, the first cause who created the material world, nothing exists that is not of the material world. The logic he used was simple. How could it, if God created everything? This view was ultimately to lead to the great clockmaker theory, the idea that God created the universe, wound it up and let it go, and is no longer involved in its operation. Natural laws were also created that kept going what had been set in motion. Called deism, many founding fathers of the United States, including one of my personal heroes, Thomas Jefferson, subscribed to this view. Much good came from it in that many superstitions were debunked. Most people no longer think, for example, that a horseshoe over the door or a rabbit's foot keychain will bring them good luck. More important, people are no longer hanged or burned at the stake for witchcraft. But for all the good the materialistic worldview brought about, it's not correct. The universe of which our solar system is a part is much more like a giant thought than it is like a giant clock. Back in the 19th century, scientists following the materialistic model got even further off track and dropped God from the equation altogether. They did so by taking Darwin's theory of evolution to a level Darwin never intended. His theory is that over generations, organisms adapt to changes in their environment through a mechanism called survival of the fittest. This makes sense. Changes that help a plant or an animal survive long enough to be able to reproduce are passed on to subsequent generations. This makes sense. The mistake comes from eliminating any other factors from the equation. If matter is all there is, intelligence could not have existed until evolution produced a brain. The odds of this happening are incredibly long and have been compared to the likelihood of one of a huge number of monkeys with typewriters producing the novel War and Peace from start to finish with no typos. Mathematicians put the odds of this happening at 1 in infinity. You might say, impossible, in other words. But if one postulates that intelligence came first, how we humans and other incredibly complex organisms were able to evolve begins to make more sense. Throughout the many eons of evolution, 4.5 billion years since the first primitive life forms appeared on Earth, needs have always preceded the organisms through which they are fulfilled. I'm talking about eyes, ears, taste buds, hearts, kidneys, livers, and so forth. Since each new organ developed in response to a need, why would the brain be an exception? As my book reveals, based on findings by University of Virginia researchers, intelligence, consciousness in other words, is able to function on its own without a brain. What evolved all over those many eons, the brain, is actually a receiver that connects our consciousness to our bodies. and enables us to function in this reality. Why do I care if the great mass of people continue to think their brains create their consciousness? Well, if they really think that, they have to think that when their bodies die, the lights go out, and that's the end of them. Think about it. People who believe that are likely to take a different approach to life than those who know they are going to exist in one form or another for eternity. That's why I believe it's important to set the record straight, because that knowledge has the potential to cause the world to be a much better place, and not knowing it can cause a person difficulty. Let me give you one very interesting example that I cite in my book. It has to do with an acquaintance of mine, a Frenchman, who told me this story years ago when my first wife and I were spending several days with him and his wife at their chateau in the Lorraine region of northern France. My acquaintance's name is Henri, and he'd inherited the chateau and the land around it long after that castle had fallen into disrepair. It had not been lived in since World War II or before. Having done well in business, he decided to restore the place. He and his wife spent quite a bit of time there while it was undergoing renovation, and were often disturbed in the middle of the night by what seemed to be someone down in the basement screaming. Inevitably, it would wake them up. At other times, they would hear the noise in that drowsy state they were in before falling asleep or waking up. This happened almost every night. Finally, they became so annoyed that Henri had the workmen tear out a wall he judged to be the place from which the uproar was emanating. A skeleton was behind it. Henri and his wife had no idea who the skeleton was, but they gave it a Christian burial. And afterward, they never again were bothered by those night noises. Here's what Henri thought about it. He believed a man had been bricked up behind the wall while he was still alive. Obviously, somebody didn't like the guy. Probably he'd been knocked on the head and put there. And then maybe he came to after the bricks were put in place. Then he died, but he did not realize he had died. It's not hard to believe this could happen to a person who thinks when the lights go out, you die and that's it. Also, this is something I discuss in my book. Time is not experienced in the mental dimension of spirit as it is here in our three-dimensional world, or four-dimensional if you add time to height, weight, width, and depth. Suffice it to say, the spirit of this dead person could easily have passed through the bricks, but the dead man didn't know it because he didn't know he was dead. He'd been calling out for help ever since. These were psychic screams, of course, because the ghost had no vocal cords. The middle of the night was the only time those screams for help penetrated the minds of Henri and his wife, because that was when all else was quiet and they were sleeping or near sleep, and their minds were sensitive to those vibrations. If you've spent your life to date believing matter is all there is, or even if you've thought there might be an afterlife but had some doubt, I suggest you read my book. It's available as a Kindle ebook for only $3.49, or in paperback for $11.95. In the description below this video on YouTube is a link to the page on Amazon.